Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about leftist politics and Christianity. I'm Matt. I teach at Greenville University, and it's Christmas break, and I'm not doing anything.
Nice. I am Dean Detloff, and I live in Canada. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, and it's not really Christmas break for me because I don't have classes anymore, but I did get sick, so it feels like Christmas break.
Yeah,
so
that's important.
I got that good frog voice going on today, so you're welcome.
Sick. Well, it's post-Christmas Day, but it's still the Christmas season because Christians sometimes, depending on their tradition, celebrate Christmas for 12 days. That's like the song, 12 Days of Christmas.
Ever heard of it?
If you'll recall. So on that note, this is the Magnificast Christmastide extravaganza. We're super psyched about it. In this episode, we're going to talk about something super cool. Ernesto Cardenal's The Gospel in Solentiname. This book is a record of dialogues, I guess. Maybe that's how we could just call them. It's just that's all it is. Just dialogues between a Catholic priest, Ernesto Cardenal, and some campesinos, who I guess just are basically farmers. That's the word they use, though, and I like it, so I'm going to say it. Between a priest and farmers who live in a remote location in Nicaragua called Solentiname. I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. I don't know anything about Spanish, so maybe I'm doing it completely wrong. I don't know. Anyways, the dialogues are really neat because it's a way to sort of read the gospel alongside with just the people who the gospel's written for, like the poor people, and kind of reflect on what's so wild about Christianity and Christmas. So here we are putting the Christ back in Christmas and reading the gospel with some extremely good liberation theology type folks.
It is the class war on Christmas on this podcast this week.
But before we get into the trenches of that war, we're going to read some iTunes reviews first. Okay. So there are two reviews, and they're both extremely good.
That's how I like my reviews.
The first one. No, okay. I'm going to read the shortest one first, and then the longest one second, because why not? Okay. So the first review is from username God's Baby 2018.
Perfect for Christmas time.
Yeah, and they actually left this review for us on iTunes on Christmas, December 25th, 2017. Nice. They must have been listening whilst their family were, being families or something. I don't know. Anyways, that's extremely good dedication to this podcast to listen to it on Christmas Day. Okay, the title of this review is They May Be Boys, 5 out of 5 stars. They may be boys, but this is good listening, comrades. That's all they said. That was the review, and I think it's good. It's good. It is good listening. They're not wrong.
Yeah. I also appreciate the "they may be boys" qualification because we are limited by our being boys.
Yeah,
and I'm glad that people are willing to look past that on occasion.
It's so nice that they do. All right, the second review is pretty wild. I'm a little bit embarrassed to read it because it's so funny. Okay, so here it goes. This is by Brett W.A. on December 15th, so before Christmas. It is titled Great Podcast or The Greatest Podcast, 5 out of 5 stars. Looks like they made up their mind. 5 out of 5 stars, so must be greatest. Okay, hold on to your butts for this one.
I'm holding on.
I'm going to have a hard time getting through this without just falling over dead. Matt and Dean, or as I refer to them inside my own head, Magnanimous Maddie B, and Dean the Dreamboat D. So here's the thing, I can't read any further. That's actually that's like the first sentence, but I can't read any further. People in my high school youth group called me Maddie B. So Brett,
is that right?
Yeah, no joke. My wife can confirm. So whoever this person is, maybe I went to youth group with them, or maybe
they also called me a dreamboat in high school too. That was widely known as my
Yeah, I believe it. Okay, so Matt and Dean are truly top tier TM. That's what they did. TM trademark. The podcast is deeply philosophical, informative, entertaining, and genuinely funny, which one may not necessarily expect from a Christian communist podcast. I don't know why, because that's the biggest joke of everything. You sincerely feel as if you're listening to two of your close friends talk. It's precisely that sort of warmth and authenticity that keeps me coming back week after week to eat and drink from, and maybe even bathe in the Magnificast trough. TM.
It's a gross trough.
Yeah, it's. You can get the Magnificast trough on our Etsy store that's coming. So just keep an eye out for that.
We let people do anything in it, so whatever you want.
Just anything.
Bathe in it, eat out of it, whatever.
All of the things. But you got to get your own. That's the important thing. Okay, I also love when they straight dunk on reactionaries. Me too. I mean, if podcasting was like late 90s NBA basketball and reactionaries were playing defense, then Matty B and Dreamy Dean would be Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady of dunking on dudes. That's not a reference I get completely because I've actually never watched sports, but I think that's good. I like it. I think it's good.
I did play a lot of NBA Street on PlayStation when I was a child, and so I would say my frame of reference understands at least the point that's being conveyed here, and I do appreciate it.
Yeah. Dunk, 3-point. That's all I got.
That 3-point dunk. It's extra points for just being so good at dunking.
How many points do you get if you're at half court? Do you get 3 or 4?
I think you get all the points you need to win the rest of the game.
Yeah, that's true. They give you the secret code to play as Bill Clinton.
Yeah, it sort of depends on the pace and the nature of the game, whether or not you unlock the Bill Clinton cheat in real life.
That's an NBA Jam joke, by the way. Only 90s kids are going to get that one. Anyways, the show is great. If you're not listening to it, seriously, get your life together and get on that. I don't want to have to come over to your house and force those headphones on. So, I mean, I guess this person's going to do that. So
yeah, ending with a threat. That's not exactly our style, but I'm not gonna disparage it.
I literally have just been was just reading some student reviews from the past semester, and none of them were that positive. So it makes me feel very good.
Hey, so here's something you should review. How are your Christmas gifts before we get into this?
10 out of 10. Very good gifts.
Nice.
I got all kinds of good stuff. Most notably, I don't know, they're all extremely good. But one that I'm just really excited about is my wife got me this big and awesome like pen and ink drawing of Fidel. So I'm gonna put that in my office.
Nice.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's good. It's good stuff. What about you? Did you get any like good loot?
I did. Emily got me a great T-shirt from the Zapatistas. Well, from Schools for Chiapas, which supports the Zapatistas. It's got a good Marcus sort of photocopy image, and it says in Spanish apparently because Emily reads Spanish and I do not. It's got the Zapatista quote of excuse us, where this is just a revolution or whatever it is. I don't know the exact words escape me right now, but you get the idea. Yeah. Anyhow, I had to explain to you my well, I won't say who. I had to explain to somebody what it was, someone who probably does not love the Zapatistas or wouldn't. So I described it as being a really thoughtful gift supporting one of my favorite nonprofits in the world. So that's how I'm referring to the Zapatistas from now on.
That's also technically true, so there you go.
Yes, so that was the standout gift of 2017.
Oof, good gifts all around.
Cool. Well, there you have it. Christmas, 10 out of 10, 5 out of 5 stars. I don't know exactly what all these 8 out of 8 ornaments. I don't know, whatever metric you want. All the bars are filled. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about my own Christmas except that I don't know, it was like it's very cold in Toronto. That's it.
Ooh,
there's nothing else that's interesting to say about it.
No. It was good.
I went to midnight mass.
Oh, sick. What's that like?
Pretty good. There's all kinds of stuff going on in Catholic midnight mass. Lots and lots of incense at this one in particular. I went to a Jesuit parish in Toronto, which I really like, Our Lady of Lourdes. And that was fun. And I sat next to a philosopher that I know, James Olthius. If you don't know who he is, you ought to. He's a cool guy. But it was pretty good because we got there super early so that we could get seats. And Jim was telling me about Derrida and global Latinization. which is like I don't know, Derrida's really fascinating read on kind of how bad Christianity is and how it like takes over the entire world in this like horrifying way. And that was like a really wild preface to Midnight Mass, but I was into it. I dug it.
That sounds like the best. I just met up with some friends at IHOP, so seems like
the
you
Midnight
won.
Mass for Protestants.
Yeah, it's at IHOP. I got some Nutella crepes and they're extremely good. So not
Midnight Mass of calories.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Good. Merry Christmas. Ho ho ho, etc. Well,
Cool.
let's get into it, Dean. Tell us what's up with this book.
All right, this is a good book. We read some of it in the last episode with Catherine from Friendly Anarchism, and that was really fun. And people were like, "We're craving so much more," and we were too. So we got a hold of a copy of it, and here's a little bit of background. So Ernesto Cardenal is a priest in Nicaragua, and he started a community in Solentiname, a very sort of poor region in Nicaragua, in 1968. And that was after a very important conference held in Colombia among a bunch of Latin American bishops called the Medellin Conference. And if you don't know anything about that, it's kind of credited with being one of the maybe birthplaces or high fever points of liberation theology in Latin America. So that conference happened. Ernesto Cardenal established this community, and there he had all these conversations with peasants and workers and rural folks and other folks, and they would just talk about gospel readings and biblical passages. And so he compiled this book together of transcribed tape recordings of those conversations. And the translation that we have was published in 1976 in English. So he doesn't say in the book exactly when these all happened, at least in this edition, but that's when we got it. So the wild thing about that is that Solentiname was burnt to the ground in 1977 by the Somoza regime, the brutal reactionary government in Nicaragua at the time. And that was because a bunch of people from Solentiname went to participate in an attack on Somoza forces, so they retaliated that way, and that led Cardenal to leave to live in Costa Rica in exile, where he joined the Sandinista Liberation Front, or otherwise known as the FSLN. And then, to make a long story short, when the Sandinistas formed a government, he came back to Nicaragua as the Minister of Culture. So he had a pretty prominent role in the revolutionary government. So that's like a maybe historical way of just setting this up. It's probably more than anybody wanted to know, but that's where these conversations are taking place, in Solentiname, in a very poor part that went on to become, after these conversations happened, went on to become a significant sort of site for revolutionary activity.
Yeah, that's helpful to contextualize this overall. So the book itself is, I don't know, pretty interesting too. It's not like a book of liberation theology. It's not really a book of theology at all. I mean, I guess it is in a way. It's just a little bit of a different form. So the book is just broken up into chapters where Cardinal and then people in his community are just like discussing different biblical texts and different themes and kind of relating them to their own lives and just talking through them. It's kind of like sitting in on a Bible study of people in Solentiname, but it's way more exciting than any Bible study I've ever been a part of. So yeah, just a collection of different dialogues, different back and forths and exchanges between people. So there's no like exposition. There's no like real Cardinal doesn't come at the end of the chapter and sort of say like what they really mean by this is, and then explains it. It's just kind of those conversations like laid bare for us to read and see what's up. So each one though has lots of different characters in it. I think Dean and I both have our favorites. Felix, Olivia, Julio, old Tomas Pina, and a few others too keep showing up time and time again. So if you hear us talking about like something that someone says, it's just like someone's name. That's because that's what the book is like, just collections of these kind of dialogues. So we're gonna try to give it to you guys straight though, not just pick our favorites, even though they're really all my favorite. Honestly, they're so good and funny.
They are.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So The book is not huge, but long enough. We decided that we wanted to kind of curate what we read and talked about on this episode based on the general theme of Christmas. So we started with chapter 6, which is called The Birth of Jesus. Obviously, that's where we're starting because that's what Christmas is all about, after all. Charlie Brown. So, Dean, do you want to introduce us to this bit here?
Yeah, sure. So, like you were just saying, it's basically a bunch of people just sort of working through the text. So, the book will present some of the text that they read, and then they kind of pause for a discussion over it. So there's a lot of stuff they say, and there are a lot of themes that are repeated in a variety of contexts throughout the book, but we kind of keyed in on just a couple, I guess. So maybe two really interesting things to note. One is that there was an earthquake that happened around the same time as this particular conversation, and that kind of sets up some really interesting reflections that we'll get into in a minute here. And then secondly, there's a lot of really cool stuff that we'll see come up over and over again where these peasants in Solentiname really read themselves into and identify with the characters and situations in the Gospels. So maybe we could start out a little bit just by talking about the theme of class disparity and how they pull that out in this conversation. So Matt, one thing that we both had underlined was a time when someone says God wanted his son to be born in a pigsty. And it's just such a good summary of how these folks are sort of understanding the conditions into which Jesus is born. I don't know, what impression did that make on you?
Yeah, that line stuck out to me. I didn't even have to go back and look it up. I just I knew that's one thing that we would have to talk about. Right, that God wanted his son to be born in a pigsty is sort of a statement that's indicative of the way that these folks in this community are reading and understanding Jesus as a person incarnated. That Jesus is not a person that is rich or born into a well-off family, but someone who is poor. And it is, explicitly clear that is the case if you actually read the Bible, which is something that I think takes some time for some people. But here's something that kind of goes along with this whole idea about Jesus being poor from kind of birth. This is from a commentator in one of these dialogues named Rebecca. She says, "The scriptures are perfectly clear, man. The fact is that Christ was born as a poor little child, like the humblest person. The scriptures keep telling us this, and I don't understand why we don't see it." It's kind of I laugh because it's funny how obvious it is that Jesus is in fact born as a child who is not, carries the name of as a king and kind of has all these sort of royal symbolism around his birth in the Bible, but at the same time juxtaposed with that is his extreme poverty, and that is an important part of the gospel that I think that we just kind of forget. We can read that in different ways, and we do, but the scriptures keep telling us this, but we don't understand why we don't see it. I don't know exactly why that happens. So interesting. So from the very beginning, the conversation is about Jesus and sort of his place in the economic class and sort of socioeconomic terms.
Yeah, no, that really stuck out to me too. And I think it was interesting how they juxtaposed that with the fact that Jesus was also not born as a rich person. That was a really cool thing that they keep emphasizing. So right after the pigsty comment, this person who's not named goes on to say, God wanted his son to belong to the poor class, right? If God had wanted him to be born to a rich lady, that lady would have had a room reserved at that hotel. Especially arriving in her condition, presumably as a pregnant woman. And I think that's so great, right? That if you really try to imagine yourself into the whole situation, it's just sort of painfully obvious that Jesus has to have been born to poor folks in a poor situation, and specifically not to rich folks.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, I went to church on Christmas. And heard a little bit about the Magnificat, which is good, but not a lot about Jesus being poor or Jesus' identification with the poor or anything about economics. Why is that, do you think? Why don't we read Jesus as being poor like they do?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, one part might be the fact that most of us aren't peasants. I mean, the good news of Jesus Christ means something sort of intuitively different to people in an extremely oppressed part of Nicaragua, I think, than it does to at least somebody like me who grew up in a pretty like comfortable middle class environment in rural Michigan. Um, so I guess it's just sort of like I think like when I was a kid, I had a vague impression that Jesus was poor, I guess, or that his family was poor, but I didn't really understand them as oppressed, or I didn't understand poverty as a symptom of oppression. So maybe that has something to do with it. Like it's really easy to kind of overlook Jesus's poverty if you think that poverty is a problem of, I don't know, social mobility, or like it might be something deserving of sympathy, but not deserving of like revolutionary change or that sort of a thing.
Right. Yeah, it is interesting how, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the same thing for me too. I guess growing up as sort of a middle class person, I didn't think about Jesus' birth narrative as necessarily meaning like poverty, but I think that it is extremely good to read it that way. You definitely get some different results about what it means for Jesus to like bring freedom or free people from sin or something like that. It means something different if Jesus is coming from a place of poverty. So a little bit further down, again from somebody else who's unnamed, there's this quote that I think is extremely good. Jesus came to free the world from these injustices, which still exist, and he came so that we could be united and struggle against these injustices, because we go right on being like that, with somebody's foot on our neck. And the rich, how do they look at us? They look down on us. That's why we've got to get together to win, or even all be a single revolutionary, like Christ. He was the greatest revolutionary. Because being God, he identified with the poor, and he came down from heaven to become a member of the lower class, and he gave his life for all of us. The way I see it, we all ought to struggle like that for other people and be like him. Get together and be brave. That way nobody will be without a house, and even if an earthquake knocks his house down, he'll get another one, and nobody will have to go on being humiliated by the rich. Again, this is what it looks like when like people who are in poverty read the gospel. This is like the good news that they see, and I think that it should be the good news that we see too. But it might just take an extra step for us to recognize that.
Yeah, and it fits so well coming with what they had just read in the Magnificat, right? Where Mary is talking about how the rich are going to be sent away empty, and the poor are going to get raised up, the hungry are going to get filled. That last line, right? Nobody will have to go on being humiliated by the rich. That, I think, is an important sort of motif behind even what Mary is singing, that the poor aren't going to get humiliated by people who are in power anymore. That's kind of the liberating motif that she feels in her own kind of situation, giving birth to the Messiah.
Yeah, it's just I know I've said this before in this podcast, and I've said it to other people over this Christmas season, that it's just like the dumbest thing in the world that like when we talk about the good news, we think that it means something metaphysical, and the real good news is maybe that people don't have to be poor, or people don't have to live without a house. Like that's right. The actual good news. Yeah.
So maybe we could talk a little bit too about the problem of like this earthquake that happened in a nearby region. So I don't know that much about Nicaragua, but the impression that I get, I guess, is that the region where it happened, Managua, was a place of, I don't know, wealth, or at least not exactly as poor as Solentiname. So they have a lot of really interesting things that they sort of toss around in this Christmas milieu, thinking about that huge tragedy. And I wonder what you made of that, Matt. I don't know, how did you sort of read this way of thinking through something like awful that happened, where a bunch of people lost their lives and their livelihoods, in the context of Christmas?
So this is actually a really interesting piece of the conversation, because it starts off as sort of like as in a really unnuanced way, and then moves on to an incredibly nuanced understanding of like the problem of evil in theology, which is really wild. I think that this is maybe the best answer I've ever heard to that question of evil, even. And again, let me stress that this is not from like a theologian. These are from just like regular folks talking about it. So yeah, there's like an earthquake, and it kills people, and that's very horrible. So they're kind of discussing it and talking about like how the earthquake is sort of like a great leveler of people, that like on the one hand, like whether you're rich or poor, it affects you just the same. And then someone replies back, well, kind of, except that the rich can just get a car or get a plane out of the city or whatever. And then the conversation starts to head in this direction that made me really uncomfortable when I read it. So Felix says, Felix, I believe that what happened in Managua had to happen because of the sins. That made me feel extremely uncomfortable, because I was like, wait a minute, I've heard this like elaboration on natural disasters before, but it was from Jerry Falwell.
Yeah.
So that made me kind of feel weird. Like, well, does God punish people for being rich? And then somebody else steps into the conversation, and I think adds something incredibly important. So Olivia, somebody else, I don't know anything about them, but Olivia says, the earthquake didn't happen because of sins, but the consequences of the earthquake did happen because of sins, because sins are selfishness. And this is super, I think, insightful, just because the consequences of the earthquake did happen because of sins, because it recognizes that like a natural disaster happened, and like, okay, we have to think about that in some way, but that the bad stuff about that natural disaster like happened because of like people are selfish. They hoard wealth, they hoard resources. There are people who will be disproportionately affected by an earthquake in ways that other folks won't. So that there are, I guess, structural implications behind natural disasters that we should probably think through a little bit more. That, whether or not God made an earthquake happen is a question that I guess we could ask. But the maybe more pertinent question is like, how did we make the earthquake worse, or how did we make whatever event worse? How do our sins affect the like others in these kinds of situations? What did you think?
Yeah.
Jim? Is that right?
Yeah, totally. I really appreciated that line that you referred to as well, where someone goes on to say, sufferings aren't God's punishment, because the poor are always the ones who suffer most. If you're rich, you pay for a car or a plane and you get out of the city, you don't have any problem. And then they talk a little bit about this situation where the earthquake is kind of like a huge equalizer in a way. Everybody kind of has to suffer, but even still after that, like some people are going to be able to bounce back a lot quicker than others. And they bounce back on the backs of those people who can't. And I think that's such a cool thing, or such an important observation, I guess, to be able to make that distinction. I mean, I don't know much about the problem of evil, except that I've never really figured it out. But it does make me feel a little bit better, I guess, to read something like sufferings aren't God's punishment, because the poor are always the ones who suffer most, right? Like if you really believe that the poor are the kinds of people that God identifies with, which is what they're working out in this chapter, then you couldn't hold that natural disasters as some kind of punishment for sin, because the people who actually get punished will inevitably be the people that God actually is trying to liberate.
Yeah. It's actually a really, I don't know, I guess what I like about this so much is that like theologians try to say this kind of thing, and philosophers try to like make this type of like elaboration on the problem of evil, and like, I don't know, they don't ever do it quite as good as this. Like, I don't know, here's a really wild turn for this podcast to take. So Berdayev, he does this kind of thing though. So he has this book about creativity. Is that right? The one where he talks about anthropodicy.
Yeah, the meaning of the creative act. This is a Russian theologian or philosopher type, by the way.
Yeah. Well, so he has this idea about anthropodicy, where instead of theodicy, so theodicy is about this problem of evil, about can like God do evil, basically. And he says, like, well, I don't know, but like we could ask the same question about people, like can people justify the evil that they do? And I think that we see an incredibly less terminologically hard conversation happening right here. Like, can people justify the evil that they do? And like, no, they can't.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyways, really struck by this, just like regular folks who, I don't know, don't have theological training can figure this out probably better than some of the rest of us can.
Yeah, I think part of that just comes from the strength of being willing and courageous enough to just read themselves into the text unapologetically, and having the courage to be wrong, and having the courage to experiment with different readings, and kind of hold one idea for a minute. Like, you see a lot of the time someone's like, I think this right now, and then someone challenges it, and then the person who originally held the thought actually internalizes that challenge and like runs with it in this really amazing kind of interpretive direction.
Yeah.
I guess we could use that as a segue into talking about the next part of the book where they look at the shepherds in Bethlehem, because I think they really do a good job modeling that, kind of reading themselves into the text. Was there anything that really stuck out for you or themes in that particular chapter, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of stuff going on here. I guess there are two relevant points we could talk about, I suppose. So first of all, so if Jesus is going to be poor, if he's going to be poor, born into a pigsty, like the last chapter said, then he has to be born into a place where people will accept the poor. So that is pretty important, right. And that's kind of part of the shepherds. And second, I guess, is just that like the first people who show up on the scene, according to this reading at least, are people who are like workers. They're not anyone else, just the working folks, people from the fields and so on. So again, we have these kind of reoccurring themes of poverty, and like that's the way this community is kind of accessing the story overall. And I don't know, that's pretty cool. That's again another example about how these people are reading themselves in the story in ways that like I think are just way over the heads of middle class readers, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And also, not only is it a place that welcomes the poor, that's one thing they identify with, but also a place where the poor can see themselves be welcomed. I think that was another point that was really cool. There's a moment where this guy Oscar says the shepherds wouldn't even have wanted to go to a rich man's house if Jesus was born there, because they would have seen that he wasn't coming for them but for the rich. Mm-hmm. And I think that was so great. And then Cardenal replies, "And the rich don't need liberation. What liberation do the rich need?" And then William replies, "The rich need to be liberated from their money," which is amazing.
I know, that's so good.
I just love that. Like, they're making so many connections all at once by being able to think about poor people as poor people, and that's something that I like genuinely could not do. Like, I guess I would just be too worried about reading like 30 commentaries or something before I said something like that.
Yeah.
And I just like that they're like, no, we know how poor people think. Like, I wouldn't trust I wouldn't trust like a liberating baby in a rich guy's house, but I would trust a liberating baby in like a manger.
Yeah. Along the same lines too, earlier in this chapter, Felipe says this extremely good thing. Okay, so he's commenting on like why the angel came to the shepherds first to tell them that Jesus was born. And he says, "The angel of God could have gone to the king's palace and said to him, 'The Savior has been born,' but the angel didn't go there. The angel didn't go where the king was, but where the poor people were, which means that his message is not for the big shots, but for the poor little guys, which means the oppressed, which means us." So it's just like this descending like sort of like, okay, like this is actually for us and not for the rich, and it's like them seeing themselves in the story itself. And like I think that at least in my experience growing up in sort of an evangelical church, that like this type of thought is like never really given much time. Like Jesus, like today was born in the city of David a savior for you, and like, but like who's the you in that sentence? I guess it's just us in this church, right? But when we read it here alongside these other folks, the you is maybe not all of us in this church. It's maybe for some other people first, maybe us later. That would be fine. But like other people hear the good news before we do, and that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, that's right. And I also appreciate the way that they keep allowing that good news to be good news for them today. Like that you is still them, right? In an important kind of way. There's a great thing where they talk about the angel appearing to the shepherds, and then they kind of imagine themselves into that situation. So same guy, Felipe, he says, "The angel is any idea, any inspiration that you get in the woods when you're there cutting wood. Like Felix says, any idea about doing something for other people, for the community. It's the Holy Spirit, because the Spirit is the spirit of love for others, right?" And then Julio says, "Well, that's why I just said that maybe that angel already came, and we don't need to wait for him to come in the form of a vision, personally. Because maybe right now, when we're reading this and hearing these words, the angel is coming to give us the news. And then Cardinal finally replies, "That's right. At this very moment, you are receiving the same news from the angel that the shepherds received." I love everything about that. I mean, it's so beautiful to kind of think that way about making the text present in actual human lives today, and not a kind of collection of like maybe true and maybe not true historical data or something like that.
Right.
Like there's something about this narrative that's trying to speak. And I also appreciate that Cardinal, as a ordained priest, is kind of giving them the permission to hear it that way.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Like I can imagine, I don't know, telling that to one of my pastors and they'd be like, well, slow down a minute. Like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know. Just like it was, let's contextualize this. No need to proof text any of this here. And, being extremely academically rigorous with the text. But I think that's pretty funny. Pretty cool.
Yeah, totally.
Hey, let's get back to this other part that I didn't pick up on. I mean, you said it earlier, and I want to talk about it now instead of when you actually said it. About the rich needing to be liberated from their money. I like that so much.
Yeah.
So let's just unpack that a little bit here. Liberate is such a cool word to use in the sentence because liberation is a very good and positive thing, right? It's where you're like unyoked, you're set free from something. Usually when we think about liberation theology, we're thinking about people being liberated from their poverty, from the poor material conditions they're in. But here we're thinking about liberation in another way, the liberation of the rich from their money. And I like that a whole lot. I think that's a cool way of thinking about it. So the rich need to maybe be liberated from their money is, I think, a cool rhetorical turn. I think it's good in a lot of other ways. But I think it has some pretty serious consequences. What do you think, Dean?
I agree. Surprise. I think it's cool. This is a common theme you see in leftist liberation theologies from Latin America. I remember encountering it also in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he makes this really interesting point about how liberating the oppressed would also be liberating for the oppressor. It's just that the oppressor wouldn't be the one doing the liberating, and it might not sort of seem like a liberating moment to them, despite the fact that it would be. Like getting liberated from your money is not exactly probably how most people who have money would understand that situation. Historically, it's not how they've understood it anyway. But what's nice about liberation theology is they really do authentically care about like helping wealthy people escape those chains as well. There's this kind of weird moment of love where like they love their oppressors enough to try to do something about the chains that they've put on themselves in a way. You see that theme come up a lot in this. Like there's this kind of weird ambivalence where all these voices sort of want to affirm the rich as human beings that they should love because they're Christians in a church, and also want to not use that as a way to paper over the real material difference that those people are making against the community in Solentiname. And I think that's just a really important thing that a lot of North American Christians especially just can't really wrap their heads around.
Yeah, so I think that you're right. It's definitely something that we can't wrap our heads around, especially when folks like Joel Osteen are running around doing their thing. Like, I think that if we were really good Christians, if we were a really good Christian podcast, we'd be really out to liberate Joel Osteen from his money.
Yeah, that's right. That's what we're trying to do with this campaign, to usurp his throne on the iTunes popularity list. But
that's
we're not
true.
doing a good job of it.
Yeah, good point. Because if we can get more listens than him, he won't have as much money or something. I don't know how iTunes works, actually. So.
We'll liberate him from all those good iTunes feelings that he gets every time he just boots up that iPod.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the logic behind that is really interesting, though. This is actually something we talked about with Derek Ford about 100 years ago, about 30 podcast episodes ago, where like loving your enemy might mean stopping them from doing something extremely bad. And in this situation, like it's that same kind of idea. That the rich need to be liberated from their money because if they don't, they'll continue to perpetuate poverty and they'll continue to squash people who are like Jesus, and that would be the worst.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a really good point. And I think it just also helps to, I mean, I'm going to say this forever for the rest of this podcast, but it just helps to keep contextualizing these revolutionary movements as movements of love in a really deep sense. They get like easily written off as fueled by hate and resentment, but if you actually look at how people are trying to navigate and organize their feelings, that's not actually what seems to be the case.
Yeah, that's true. So right after that whole bit about liberating the money from people, there's this kind of funny thing. Okay, so right after that conversation, Francisco says, "And the poor also have the chance to be great, like the Messiah who was born like the common people." And then Cardenal responds, "The people really have great abilities that only need to be developed. When the people have education, enough food," and then trails off. Right after that, Natalia chimes in and says, "Like in Cuba, where all the children are healthy. They're all taken care of when they're sick and everything. If you are old, they take care of you. They give you everything you need, and you're healthy and eager to work. And there the poor can learn a profession. And where can anybody do that here?" I like this so much because in their imagination, like their sort of political imagination in this very moment, like Cuba is that kingdom of God or something, right? It's like that more like, maybe not kingdom of God, like I'm not going to be like that, but it's like that slightly more utopian space where like where justice is actualized in some real material ways that would make a difference to them.
Yeah, that's right. It also kind of draws out the theme that shows up throughout the book where they're constantly sort of encouraging each other to think of themselves as potential Christ figures, potential moments of liberation in themselves. Like they're just not afraid to identify real eschatological hopes with also real material people and projects and political solutions. And I think that's really impressive. It also kind of just keeps going back to that theme we were talking about earlier, where I think sometimes we're a little too reticent to make those kinds of interpretive moves, and you know, people want to like pump the brakes because they're not academically sanctioned. And like, I get it. I mean, you know, whatever. I know, like, I wouldn't want to license like fascists reading their destinies into the Gospels, which is like what has happened in history. But I mean, these people aren't fascists; they're peasants, and the reason that they identify with what they see in the Christmas narrative is that they identify other peasants and other poor people. And I think that's just like a really amazing thing to kind of see them make all these connections.
Yeah, it is for sure. And then just, I mean, reflecting on my own life and trying to think about how like my churches in the past, any church I've ever gone to, like they all do the same thing. Like they read themselves into the gospel. Like they position themselves in the story in a certain space. But it's like it's never rightly done, I don't think. Like, I don't know, we're not the shepherds or the wise men. We're not like Jesus-like figures. We're like, I don't know, the people who show up to the wedding at Cana and just like want to have a good time and hang out for a bit. Like, we're like, I don't know, Jesus's good acquaintances that are like, well, we'll hang for a bit, but I don't know, this might get too wild. Like,
that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, I've been working on it a lot. Been workshopping that.
Just workshopping it.
Yeah. So, I don't know. Figuring out where we actually read ourselves into the story, I think, is important. These folks are identifying with Christ, and I think they are right in doing so. And when we read the gospel, we probably do it in some different ways. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to jump in and think like, oh, man, we would have shown up that night.
Right. Yeah, or like if we did, it actually, here's a good segue. If we did, it would probably be more the way that they talk about the visit of the wise men in the next chapter.
Yeah.
So Laureano, who is, I'm just going to put my cards on the table, my favorite. He's my favorite one. Laureano says, I think these wise men shit things up when they went to Herod asking about a liberator. I would like someone going, it would be like someone going to Somoza now to ask him where's the man who's going to liberate Nicaragua. I just love that Laureano is like, that was a really dumb idea, guys. Like, you should not go to the center of power and start asking around about where that liberation you've heard about is coming from.
Right.
And I feel like that's actually kind of the naive sense in which many, otherwise good intentioned, like progressive Christians kind of see their role. It's like they don't see themselves identifying with, corrupt despots like King Herod or something like that, or, the president of the United States, whoever it might be. But at the same time, like, they're not exactly looking for Jesus in the right spot.
Mm-hmm. Or like even if they saw Jesus in the right spot, like they wouldn't recognize him.
Yeah, that's right. That's another thing they kind of bring out in this chapter. That's right. Yeah. What else stuck out to you here, Matt? Talking about these wise men, these complicated figures.
There's another quote, I guess, along the same lines from one commentator, Don Jose. Don Jose says, they knew he was going to be born in a little town among the common people, but they were in Jerusalem visiting with the powerful. These are the wise men. Visiting with the powerful and rich in their palaces. Just like today, there are a lot of church leaders who know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and every year they preach about this at Christmas. But Jesus was born poor in a manger, but the palaces they go to all the time are rich people's houses and palaces. I guess kind of just riffing off that same point, like the birth narrative, the nativity is like about like impoverished people having a baby in a place that you ought not have babies. But yeah, we continue to ignore that along any way possible. I guess why does that keep happening? And I guess I don't know, but it keeps happening all the time, and it is really crazy. And I guess is one of those types of things where we're like purposefully misremembering the gospel and like what it actually means.
Yeah, that's right.
To make us feel better about the world or like distract us from what else is going on. Well, cool. I guess at the very end of this chapter, there's another neat part too. More on the wise men, and I guess kind of minimizing their role even a bit. Another person in the conversation, Gloria, says, these common people had a hope now, and as soon as they found out that he'd been born, they felt happy. That star, maybe it was the townsfolk talking, and it got to the wise men. So in this case, it's like a little bit of a different situation. Mm-hmm. Even that, I like this reading because the wise men really have like no part in the story. There's like they heard about it. Like, yeah, cool.
We'll check it out. Whatever.
Yeah, I mean, we're pretty wise. We'll see if it's actually a thing.
Yeah, I think I like too that the wise men really serve so many different symbolic functions in these conversations. There's like we've been saying, they function as kind of in a critical role as like the elite. But one cool thing is they go on to note that after they visit Jesus, they get warned that they shouldn't go back to Herod in a dream, and Thomas replies to that saying, the wise men go off by another route. He inspired them not to inform on him because he was already a fugitive. I guess, speaking of God, he made them see they shouldn't go back the same way. It was better to go another way, already defending his body. At least that's what I think. And then Felipe says, by now they were like fugitives too. They went off by another way, like they were fleeing. And I think that if they'd returned to the capital, they'd have been killed. And I think it's cool that the wise men kind of start out in this chapter as these kind of maybe like bougie curiosities, and then they end up being fugitives because they actually saw this kind of liberating moment,
right?
And were moved by it. I think that's really cool. And then they choose the right side, right? Like they don't go back to Herod, and they don't kind of sidle back up to the ruling powers. They defend the baby liberator. And then there's another great moment right after all of that. This is also a good example of how different experiences, I think, really illuminate the text. So Alejandro says, well, the liberator was born in an atmosphere of persecution, and those who come to see him are also persecuted. The people must have kept the secret. And then it says Olivia, his mother, Alejandro's mother. The truth is that ever since he was at his mother's breast, he had the rich against him. When she was pregnant, Mary had sung that her son was coming to dethrone the powerful and to heap good things upon the poor and to leave the rich without a single thing. And from his birth they pursued him to kill him. And then he had to flee in his mother's arms and with his papa. And I just love that, like, moment of maternity in this text where Olivia just kind of, as a mother, she just hears her son kind of talking about liberation, and she herself is now kind of thinking about Mary, and Mary's song of liberation, and talking about Jesus the way that a mother, would talk about a son. I think that is such an amazing thing too. Just having the courage, again, to kind of see themselves in this text, I think is really a neat and illuminating thing.
Yeah, it totally is. Here's a bad segue. That's the brand that we're known for. So the last chapter we read is also about mothers and children. That's the segue right there.
Nice.
So, but to recap, I guess, so we read about the birth of Jesus, we read about the shepherds, and then the wise men, and then the last chapter we read was, I guess, about the main sort of political drama in the nativity and the birth narrative of Jesus, and that is when Jesus, Joseph, and Mary all flee to Egypt because Herod's out to kill all the baby boys. So I guess a quick contextualization of this chapter, though, before they kind of get into the conversation about that bit where Herod is going to kill the children or whatever, Cardenal, I guess, seemed like it was important for him to contextualize their conversation with this. Shortly before we had Mass this Sunday, a National Guard patrol came to inspect our houses. Martial law had been declared throughout the country, with a suspension of individual liberties. Some people seemed to be a little afraid, but the children rushed gaily throughout the church and made so much noise that it was hard at times for us to hear clearly the commentaries on this gospel passage. Okay, so it's, I guess, worth noting because this is about like an incredibly dark moment, sort of a theme that keeps coming up for the Jewish people if you read the Old Testament too. But then even as they're reading this, some like pretty dark political things are happening to their community as well. But there's a funny juxtaposition by like sort of the tenseness of martial law and like the children being loud in church, which is something I really like a lot.
Yeah.
There's something like in the way that Cardinal is kind of setting this up for us here before we even read any of the commentary. It's like the children of the real revolutionaries. Like they have like a spirit that surpasses the crappiness of dictatorships.
Yeah, that's right. And they bring that out explicitly in the conversation. The children are sort of the figure of the revolution. And like on that point, children are, I guess, potential sites of revolution in a way that's really threatening to the powers that be, and that is definitely not lost on these readers. And again, they bring it back to their own community, where one of them says, it's just like what goes on nowadays, and it's because anyone that is struggling for the liberation of the oppressed, he himself is a Christ, and then there's a Herod. And what we're seeing is the living story of the life of Jesus. And more Herods will come along, because whenever there's someone struggling for liberation, there's someone who wants to kill him. And if they can kill him, they will. How happy Somoza would have been if Ernesto Cardenal and Fernando, his brother, who was also in attendance, and also a Jesuit priest, had died when they were little kids, so they wouldn't be teaching us all this. It's perfectly clear that the business of Herod and Christ, we have it right here. That is so wild. I think just even bringing it down to like naming a person sitting in front of you as a danger to a particular regime, and kind of making that connection that, yeah, like the ruling powers probably would have liked to kill that person as a baby before they got too revolutionary. Mm-hmm. That's such a wild realization to kind of make in that community.
Yeah, I think so. It is very wild. That point gets carried out throughout the conversation in another pretty interesting way that, again, is another, well, here, I'll just go on to read it rather than like stumble over it like a complete idiot. Okay, so this whole thing about children and their possible potentialities and revolutionary spirit and so on, it gets picked up more throughout this conversation. So one person named Donald, says this, but in the gospel, it's a tiny child that they're persecuting, and here they're not going to persecute a newborn child from the time when he was born. They were looking for Jesus to kill him, and his parents had to save his life. Okay, so that's Donald kind of weighing in the conversation. They're trying to kill Jesus because it's like a particular circumstance. No one's trying to kill newborn children out here. Where then another boy chimes in, though. Just another one of the boys, not Donald. Just one of the boys, one of the good boys that's out there, says this. I think the same thing happens here, Donald. Can I say something? You know what country we're in and how there's so much infant mortality and so many stunted, undernourished children. I think that's persecuting children. I think the same thing is happening here as happened to Christ when he was persecuted as a kid. Okay, and that
is a good boy.
Is a good boy. That's that good analysis that seriously takes us academics forever to actually figure out. But what he's referencing is like a structural analysis of the situation where like children and like poor children are disproportionately affected by poverty in such a way that like the rich don't necessarily care what happens to them. Like they maybe there's no Herod kind of figure that's like going out and making sure they all die, but there's definitely no one stopping them, or there's no one like raising any huge red flags about that.
Right.
It's just such a really powerful thing to recognize and realize that that's persecution. Letting children die is persecution.
So this whole kind of reflection on what's going on in terms of the political climate surrounding political culture that wants to kill children, I think is really interesting as it relates to like a contemporary boring internet debate on whether or not the Holy Family are refugees. So people are like, I don't know, are Mary, Jesus, and Joseph refugees when they go to Egypt? First of all, I don't know, who cares? You should care about refugees either way. But secondly, I think it's probably just even more important to understand that people have to move around because of like actual material political problems, and that's like extremely bad. So Cardenal, reading this biblical passage, reflects on it in terms of Nicaragua, saying, I said that there are many campesino families that have had to leave their homes in many parts of Nicaragua, fleeing from misery and hunger, or because they have been driven off their lands, or because the National Guard is killing the campesino leaders, burning farmhouses, raping women, jailing whole families, torturing, and the pictures of all those families fleeing, mothers carrying their children in their arms, is the same as the flight to Egypt. And I think, like, it's important to try to find ways to identify these kinds of biblical stories with actual material realities happening today. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, like, was the Holy Family a refugee family? It's like, well, maybe when you're thinking about refugees, they are. Like, maybe when you're thinking about what's happening in Nicaragua in the 1970s, they are in that situation. Like, that's what these stories are for. They're meant to be kind of handles that you can use to, like, get a hold of what's happening to you through these other kinds of symbolic situations.
That's a good way of thinking about it. And sometimes, I don't know, I guess hearing this type of conversation coming from folks who actually experience it is way different than hearing it from, the white progressive church on Facebook too.
Yeah.
So just differences in tone and rhetoric and importance coming from different audiences.
Yeah.
Hey, here's a quick dunk, kind of to lighten the mood a tad bit. This is important. It needs to be said because it's so good. Okay, so they're having this conversation about Herod, like sort of like after this bit we just read. People were weighing in on Herod. Herod was a coward. It was because he was a coward that he committed all those murders. A lousy coward. And then, like, kind of this continues a little bit. Herod didn't kill armed soldiers. He killed poor children. Like, that sucks. And Herod's, like, the worst. And I get it. I agree. And then, like, kind of out of nowhere, this really funny thing happens. And it says this. A Protestant who has come from the coast opposite. They persecuted Jesus, but he wasn't in opposition to any government. And then Felipe, my main squeeze in this whole thing, Felipe says, he came as the king of the Jews. What more opposition do you want? And then the conversation, then the best thing is just like even what precedes that. Another young man, Herod, of course, that millionaire with his power, he had everybody crushed. So like it's like some like stupid like Protestant wanders in the room, says a bad opinion. Felipe like dunks on him, and then it's just like, Yeah, so Herod sucks again, right?
As we were saying before, we were so rudely interrupted by this Protestant nerd.
It's also the only time that Protestant shows up in the conversation, too, by the way. Everyone after that is just like, totally cool. So it's just like this one, one dumb Protestant just like walks in the room and just completely ruins the vibe. And then I'm just like, nah, I don't think so. So, I guess the moral of that story is don't be that Protestant ever. Protestant friends, let's just try to avoid that.
That is extremely good. Yeah, I also love that moment. It's a good little window.
Speaking of not being that Protestant, and wanting to be an actually like good Christian, the conversation after that kind of turns in a different direction, where Pancho, someone who identifies himself as a person who is not a socialist but a Christian, asks the group as a whole, like what needs to happen in Nicaragua? Like what would it look like to see change in the country? And different people kind of like weigh in on the conversation in a few different ways. Manuel says, if there's going to be change, you have to cooperate. And then Pancho responds, what? Like how? Cooperate with what? And the conversation takes an important turn, though. Pancho identifies, I think, the most true thing about revolutions, and also the most interesting and scariest thing. Pancho says this: how do you do it? I'd like somebody to tell me. That's the way it's going to be done. But you can't. When we rise up, they kill us. And then Alejandro says, but look, they killed him too. Pancho, correct. But he was Christ, and we're never going to compare ourselves with him. Manuel says, but I heard there have been other men, like Che, who have died for freedom. Pancho says, right, you can die, you and tomorrow we'll all be dancing, and we'll never think that you died for us. Then a person named William chimes in and says, then you think that those deaths are useless. Pancho responds, they're useless, or they're almost useless. And then finally, young Miriam says, I say that when there's someone who will free our country, there will be another Christ. So here again, we see the ways that these people are reading their own context and situation into the person of Christ in a way that is incredibly interesting and I think insightful. That Christ for them is a figure that actually liberates, that does something, that gives them a type of freedom that's not just like an altar call or devotions or something like that, right? The freedom that they see in Christ is something that is a bit more real, one that actually changes their life and what their lived reality might be. Other people bring that type of thing too. Che, for example, which is a really cool inclusion. And Pancho needs to adjust his attitude because those deaths mean something, and that when people try to bring freedom, there will be another Christ. It's a pretty strongly worded statement, but it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild because on the one hand, like, Pancho isn't completely wrong, right? Like, they do, like, they will potentially lose their lives, and having that kind of attitude, like, it's not like Pancho doesn't want something to change, it's just that he doesn't want people to talk without kind of understanding the real material possibility that they're gonna get killed for it. And like in 1977 this whole community got burnt to the ground for doing exactly that. So like, that's not like a bad concern, and something that I even have like trouble kind of rebuking, because like I don't live in that situation at all, but I do find myself extremely inspired by the response of the people around him by saying, they're willing to do that, and they're inspired by both Christ and Che to do that.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, you're right that there are costs of life in liberation movements. That's completely true. I guess the important thing to me is just like those deaths are actually important and they matter, and I think that is demonstrable through history. I mean, like, there are all kinds of other characters who have been killed in liberatory struggles who we do remember that means something really important to the movements that they're around. Che, for sure, or like to the American labor movement, like Joe Hill, other people like that. Mm-hmm. But I guess when there's someone willing to free a country or work towards liberation, there's another Christ. Huh.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Another Christ is a pretty radical thing that a lot of people don't want to say, and I like that they're so open about it over and over and over again.
But it kind of fits into their hermeneutic of thinking through like how the Bible works and acts on them. Like earlier we talked about the ways that like this is the good news that keeps getting said like over and over again, right? Like like they're hearing an angel say it or something. And I think it's kind of a similar way this works for them too, that like the good news is told over and over again, and then I guess like Christ has to come over and over again.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, before like some nerd is like, hey, that's taking away the specificity or sovereignty of Christ. And when I say some nerd, I'm talking about Jacques Ellul specifically. This is a common hermeneutical strategy, not just used by peasants in Nicaragua, but also used by all your favorite weird medieval commentators, from Meister Eckhart to I don't know, like pick your medieval theologian. Like they're constantly just making stuff up, using biblical characters and stories as symbols and allegories to say things that are not what they are saying in the text, but they do work for them in specific contexts to get specific points across. And like this is something that Christians have done forever. Like we've read these texts and we've found ways to repurpose them and to read ourselves into them, whether we're honest about it or not. And I think like Matt earlier, when you were saying that so many of us in North America, like we read ourselves into these texts as well. It's just that we don't recognize that that's what we're doing. Whereas these people are doing it explicitly, and I think in a really cool and important way. So yeah, I guess probably the thing that really brings all this political reading of the Bible home to me is something that Fernando Cardenal, Ernesto's brother, says toward the end of this chapter. He puts it pretty simply. He just says, I don't understand how you can read the Gospels and get spiritual lessons for your life out of it and not get involved in the revolution. This book has a very clear political position for anyone that reads it simply, as you read it. But there are people in Managua who read this book, and they are friends of Herod, and they don't realize that this book is their enemy. And I think that is the kind of hermeneutic that I really want to recover, I guess, even in my own like spiritual life. I really want to read it simply enough to find that clear political position, I guess.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you enjoyed this Christmas episode, you should go subscribe to us on iTunes or follow us on Twitter. Like our Facebook page. We got two of them. We got a regular Facebook page, and then we have another one called the Magnificast Basement, where you can like ask questions or post articles or have a conversation with one of us. It's pretty fun. There's a community of people that post there, and you could be one of them if you wanted to. Cool. So have a great rest of your Christmas time, post-Christmas season, and remember, don't be like that dumb Protestant we talked about earlier in this episode.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.